Welcome to another Plowman's Backyard video. I'm Kendra and today we are cleaning up the gardens. It's fall and it's a great time to get things cleaned up. As you can tell, this is my seed bed or my lettuce bed depending on what I'm wanting to do with it that year. So I've had people ask me over the course of the last few months if I can do a cleanup video or how I clean up my garden. There's really no right or wrong way to clean up your garden. Typically I clean up most of my garden in the late October, early November. And I'm picking most of my harvest usually around September and October. So I'm getting a lot of the stuff out of the garden then. And then the cleanup in late October is really just picking up extra weeds, dead plants, or plants that have been kind of demolished by slugs and bugs and moss and things like that. And then leftover things that may have been damaged by frost. And it's also time to kind of prep for the springtime. So if you've been following us, you would know that we had a particularly wet season this year and my garlic suffered from that. So this year, my plan is to plant my garlic in a raised bed. It'll be the first time I do that. So we're going to see how that goes. So I'm just prepping this bed specifically for my garlic, and I need to get that in the ground in the next few weeks because it's a perfect time, perfect temperature to be doing so. Now you may be wondering what I've been doing with all the leftover weeds I've been pulling out. We give them to our chickens typically. It's a great way of getting some nice greens into our chickens, and they absolutely love it. And they're also picking up, different bugs and things off of there. So it's really good for them. And it's a great way of just kind of getting rid of some of that the greenery that doesn't need to be needed or the weeds. Another thing you can do with it is also composting. Typically right now we're just kind of giving it to our chickens as extra feed this time of year just before they get locked up for the winter months. I love watching the chickens this time of year, especially going through and they just love the greenery. They love all the garden scraps. And especially this little guy, he or she, I should say, is really growing quite nicely. And we do have a couple new little chicks on the homestead that we will get to showing you soon, hopefully. They're just kind of enjoying this greenery because it is getting a lot colder, which means there's a lot less growing and coming up this time of year. And they unfortunately do spend a lot of the winter months locked up indoors. So this is one of my other raised beds. It was used for my lettuce specifically. And so I'm just cleaning it up. It was full of weeds. Doug's giving me a hand here, but this bed here I'm going to be using for my purple Russian garlic. It's my new variety that I'm trying. So I wanted to keep it separate from my other varieties that I've been growing. And this will be specifically for that. So I just want to see how it's going to go. It's going to get some nice full sunlight here. And it's got a lot of nice rich soil in this bed as well. The chickens really do love when we give the scraps to them. And you can always, collect your scraps even after the chickens get through it and put it in the compost as well. I'm really thinking about removing a lot of this fencing that we have here and just kind of rearranging things and possibly doing a compost bin here because not a lot, as you can see, there's nothing really growing up here. The chickens have been in this pen for about 3 years now, and they have really got it so that nothing grows in it. So I'm thinking about putting a couple compost bins in this area. And it does get quite a bit of sunlight in the winter as well as in the summertime. So I'm thinking it'd be a good spot to go ahead and do that. And if I still wanted to have the chickens in this area, there's no harm in having the chickens near or in the compost area, and they help kind of turn things over as well. So one advantage about doing your garden kind of cleanup in the fall instead of the spring, because you can do your garden spring cleanup as well. I like doing the fall because there's so much stuff to do in the spring that we just don't have time to do everything. And another reason is you can really fertilize your garden, and then over the winter it's kind of releasing all the nutrients and stuff in the soil, prepping it then for the springtime. A lot of things that we do remove in the gardens are, a lot of the dead plants, diseased tomatoes. You just want to get rid of a lot of the things that had, maybe bugs and different things on them and get them out of the garden. And anything that's kind of decaying and stuff like that is really good to get out of the garden as well. I like to try and really get things as ready as I can, as soon as possible in the fall, so that when spring comes around, I can really get into the garden sooner rather than later, rather than going out and kind of cleaning up, because we have to wait for the ground to thaw and then kind of work the garden, work the soil, till it or whatever we need to do, and then plant. And a lot of our planting doesn't happen until the second week of June here, just because of the temperatures and things. And a little bit, I want to say root vegetables or cold hardy seeds or crops in that we plant can be done late May, but a majority of our garden does get planted around, the second week of June, around the 10th of June or so. So as much as that can be done in the fall is better for us here in this location. Now, if we had like a nicer, warmer spring where I could plant the beginning of May, then that would be really different. But unfortunately, it's just so cold, damp, and wet that really I can't get in the gardens until at least mid-May. There is definitely no shortage of jobs to do in the fall, but I tend to be more pressed in the spring for things to do. So I'm just kind of making sure that I've got this garden bed that I'm doing for my garlic. I want lots of nutrients in it. So I have this leftover bag of Pro Mix from when I was starting my seeds and transplanting in the springtime. Now, I don't want to save this bag over winter because I find that it goes so dry, kind of hydrophobic. So I'm going to be using it and putting it into this raised bed. As you can tell, years of going by that the soil has been kind of been being diminished, and that's because I did like kind of like a hugelkultur bed in this spot. So everything underneath, the wood, the leaves, anything I added in the bottom of this bed has been decaying over time. So I need to add new soil anyway. So I had this bag of Pro Mix, so I'm adding that, as well as I had about a half a bag of peat moss laying around. So I threw that in as well. We had a little bit of compost left over, as well as some topsoil that I added to this bed that had really raised up the soil, as well as I went ahead and did some fertilizing. This bed will be perfect for the garlic, as garlic tends to be a heavy feeder, as you may have seen in our last video. I mentioned that. And if you need to learn or want to learn about growing garlic, I do have a video on that. So anyways, I just prepped this in order so that I could plant the garlic this fall, which I did do already. And so that was part of prepping and cleaning up the garden as well. And in and amongst the garden cleanup, there is always wood to be done. We had used up quite a bit of our wood from last year, and so we have to get a certain amount or a quota of wood in order to get us through the winter. So as I'm going around and cleaning up these garden beds and getting, cleaning up some stuff for the chickens and prepping this garlic bed area, my husband is working on getting the wood prepped for our winter. We do have about 1 and a bit of a row of wood, and we tend to need about 4 or 5 rows of wood to get us through at least into the springtime. So he's working hard at that, and I give him a hand, usually on the one that does most of the splitting, but since, he's been around on days off or whatever, he has been working on getting a lot split as well. So I've been focusing this year on stacking the wood and getting it ready as well. So we kind of tag team with that. I'm going to be going out this week and doing some splitting myself, and he's going to have to go out and do some more chainsawing. So it is kind of one of those things that even though we may be working in the garden and cleaning up, we still have to, dedicate some time every day that we have to prepping the wood for the winter, because it can be a long and cold winter. If we are, out in the garden all day, even if we spend, an hour, 2 hours max out there prepping the wood, that is something that it's a must and we have to do. So in and amongst the fall, with all the other stuff that we're doing, wood is definitely on the top of the list. It'll be a long winter if you're cold. So as for the tomatoes, it's really simple. I really go around, pull out all the weeds, pull out all the dead tomato plants. As you can see, I'm sure as you know, if you're a gardener, there is a lot of diseased, dead tomatoes, ripe tomatoes on the ground. And surprisingly enough, there's a ton of wasps. They just tend to be eating it since they are fermenting out there on the ground. I don't like leaving stuff decaying on my garden over the winter. You can do that. It's probably great for the soil, but because we don't have our soil open, we have the ground cloth on, I tend to take it all off. So then in the springtime, it's just really easy to go out and plant. But if you have an open bed, it's okay to do that, but you might want to minimize what you're leaving on your soil bed, things that can self-sow. So tomatoes are one of those things, they can self-sow. They may not grow as quickly as if you're, transplanting and planting them outside in the springtime, but they definitely do self-sow. So make sure that if you are keeping some of your, your dead plants and stuff, make sure there's no seeds in it so that they're not self-sowing throughout your garden. So what I typically do is I go and I remove the weeds and I go and remove the dead plants, and then I just rake up all of the tomatoes. A lot of them have black spots and things like that on them. They're not edible as far as I'm concerned, but the chickens will love them. So I'm just going to rake them up, bring them over to the chickens, and they can just have at it because they absolutely love this. And it really helps me to get the garden cleaned up, ready for next year as well. So in and amongst cleaning up the rest of the garden, so a lot of our stuff, we do harvest the most of our stuff in September and early October. We're getting a lot of the major stuff out of the garden, and the things that are kind of left in the garden right now are things that can handle frost, or things that have been damaged by frost, or things that will continue to grow even past frost. So as I go through at this point, because I know that snow is coming, I'm going to clean absolutely everything out. I might leave a couple things. I typically sometimes leave the kale in or the chard in because they will actually start back growing up in the springtime and they'll seed the second year. But they're also, sometimes I feed the deer that way because they'll come in when it's snowy and come and eat some of these greenery. So either or, it depends what I feel like doing that year, but sometimes I leave some and sometimes I don't. So as I'm cleaning up, there may be plants that I've missed or plants that have grown within the month that I've been picking stuff. So even though I picked a lot of our harvest in, late September, some plants such as these onions have grown into a decent size in which I can take it in and actually use it. And then I went through and kind of picked off some of the kale because a lot of the bottom kale was kind of going a little bit yellow, was getting some black spots, and there was a lot of the white cabbage moss that had been eating the kale and eating the chard. So what I'm doing is just kind of cleaning up some of those old yucky eaten plants or leaves that are on these plants and taking them off and just leaving the fresh stuff on top. So if I do want to come out and grab a little bit of chard or a little bit of kale, I'm taking the fresh stuff that hasn't really been ruined yet, and that's what I'm doing, kind of cleaning up that kale plant. And then as far as the beets, I hadn't picked my beets yet, but we were eating some of the beet tops. So this is about the time of year that I would go out and pick the beets, and they were fantastic. We didn't get as large of a harvest from our beets as we typically do. There was a couple good sized beets in this though, but considering the beets were so small most of the season, the fact that they grew in the last few months, I was really impressed that I actually did get some. So there's enough there for a couple meals if I cook them up and have them cooked, or you can even can these a little bit if you wanted. So then I'm also cleaning up some of the other areas of the garden that I hadn't got to, such as the zucchini and stuff. I hadn't been picking those yet. Interestingly enough, when I went over to pick the zucchinis out, there was still a couple growing, but when I went to pick up the zucchinis, there was actually a couple growing that I was kind of surprised. The wasps were eating the zucchinis. If I would just look at it normally, I would think that it was like a mouse or a chipmunk or something, but the wasps were actually devouring the zucchinis, and I was actually surprised. So anyways, I thought I'd show you that. It's kind of something new that I learned. I didn't know that the wasp would eat that. Then there was a couple leftover cucumbers in there that were quite yellow and stuff, so I'm just going to toss them over to the chickens and let them kind of finish those off. And then the last thing on the list for the last part of the garden cleanup is the beans. So typically we eat a lot of the beans, but I do save what's ever kind of left over or what's ever getting too large. What I maybe have missed when I was picking is picking some of the plants to go and dry so that I can use these beans as seeds for the following years. So basically I'm just picking the plants with the most beans on them, and I'm just kind of taking off some of the leaves because we've had frost the last few days. The leaves are still a bit damp and wet, so I'm just going to remove some of those leaves off of these bean plants and then go and hang them to dry so that the beans dry out nicely. I don't want the beans to be molding. That's what I'm doing. I'm just taking the best of what I can find with the most amount of beans, and I'm going to be drying those out because bean seeds last quite a long time. I can probably get seeds from these for the next few years, if not more, and can share them again with friends and neighbors. Anyways, that is the last portion of our garden cleanup for this year. We still have lots of stuff to do. We still have lots of wood to do, and I still have to get those chickens prepped for winter as well. But I know it's not going to be long. Anyways, thanks for joining us for this video, and we'll see you in the next one.